Sassoon called this place Dottyville. He was surrounded by the psychically shattered and shaking victims of the war. But he himself didn't really fit in. He was mentally and physically sound, and he spent his time playing golf, talking to other writers, and producing some of the great war poetry which has made his name live ever since. I see them in foul dugouts, gnawed by rats, and in the ruined trenches, lashed with rain, dreaming of things they did with balls and bats, and mocked by hopeless longing to regain bank holidays and picture shows and spats and going to the office in the train. Sassoon was speaking out for a small minority. There were 16,000 conscientious objectors who refused to fight. Some people sympathised, most did not. Pacifist meetings were broken up by angry mobs. Conchies, as they were known, were attacked and imprisoned. For Sassoon, things weren't quite as clear-cut as they were for the conscientious objectors. He was torn between his intellectual contempt for the war and its leaders and his own feelings of comradeship and exhilaration in the trenches. However vile and murderous the fighting was, it gave him more of a sense of being alive than anything here at home among the sheep-like civilians. And in the end, he decided his place was with the fighting men. He returned to the army and eventually to the Western Front, where he survived. But for the rest of his life, he never lost that seething anger with the politicians. In the spring of 1918, a new German offensive, using troops returning from the Russian front, almost broke the British and the French armies. The new stormtroopers very nearly won the war. The British commander, Sir Douglas Haig, ordered, "With our backs to the wall, each one of us must fight to the end." Back at home, Britain was descending into panic about German spies and saboteurs. In June 1918, a scandalous trial at the Old Bailey threatened to ignite this combustible atmosphere. The man behind the scandal was an eccentric right-wing MP and self-publicist called Noel Pemberton Billing. Pemberton Billing was obsessed by what he called the hidden hand. He thought the Germans had infiltrated the British establishment. There was a German black book containing the names of 47,000 sexually depraved British men and women who'd been blackmailed into helping Germany win the war. It was, he said, a most Catholic list. It contained the names of privy councillors, cabinet ministers and their wives, diplomats, newspaper proprietors, and even members of His Majesty's household. In short, the Germans had the British establishment over a barrel. Billing's theory might have been ignored were it not for a private performance of Salome, a band play by Oscar Wilde. Its star was a risqué Canadian dancer called Maud Allen. Billing saw an opportunity to promote his obsession and pounced. He implied that Maud Allen was a lesbian and that her audience were among the 47,000 traitors named in the Black Book. Maud Allen took the bait and sued for libel at the Old Bailey. The British people were transfixed. There were huge daily queues for the public gallery. The atmosphere in court was described as pantomime, circus, farce. The gallery cheered like spectators at a football match. Billing's witnesses claimed that Asquith was in the Black Book, alongside his wife, Margot, and in an extraordinary twist, Billing even claimed that the man presiding over the trial, Britain's most famous judge, Justice Darling, known as Little Darling, was involved as well. This was the conspiracy theory to end them all. And the British public seemed to be falling for Billing's extraordinary claims about pro-German homosexuals in high places. Anxiety rippled through the corridors of power. There were even fears of a revolution, a people's revolt. After a 5-day slither of titter, fodder and garbage had gurgled out of the Old Bailey, the jury took just 2 hours to acquit Billing of libelling Maud Allen. The public gallery erupted in joy. As their hero emerged from the Old Bailey, he was mobbed by more than 1,000 supporters. But what of the German Black Book itself that had started it all? Well, there's no evidence that it ever existed. It was almost certainly the fevered figment of one man's imagination, seized upon by a people driven half mad by 4 years of loss and fear and hating. But by the end of the trial, the fortunes of war were dramatically reversing. In July, the German advance was stopped, and by September, a ferocious counterattack by British, Canadian and Australian troops was smashing through German lines. These mostly forgotten battles formed one of the greatest military victories ever won by British forces. Finally, at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918, the Germans formally surrendered and signed the armistice. The guns fell silent. To start with, the reaction was celebratory, wild, even drunken. Lloyd George was hailed by the jubilant crowds as the man who won the war. But the crowds quickly sobered up and the mood darkened. The war had changed Britain in ways that would have been unimaginable 4 years earlier. More than 720,000 people never returned from the battlefields, and those at home lived surrounded by the gaps and the ghosts, those people who should have been in the street or in the factory or down the pub, but just weren't there. The civilians had pulled together and worked for the war effort as never before. They'd seen the birth of big government. Perhaps no shock has ever hit these islands with quite the force of what they called, with, let's hope, an edge of bitter humour, the Great War.